LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode has graphic descriptions of violent crime. Please listen with care. Businessman Paul Nguyen left Sydney's Hilton Hotel in May 2014 and was never seen alive again. A police investigation uncovered secrets that exposed Mr Nguyen's murky underworld connections and ultimately led authorities to a makeshift grave around an hour's drive south of Sydney. The excavation and identification of Mr Nguyen's remains was forensic anthropologist Dr. Hayley Green's first case. In this episode, hear about the complexities of collecting, analysing and documenting human bones in a murder investigation. My name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. Just going back, how did you get into forensic anthropology?
It's a bit of a convoluted story that my dad always gets a little bit funny about. So if he's listening, sorry, Dad. I really loved ancient history in high school. I was very much in the history and the archaeology side of things, brought up on Indiana Jones and wanting to sort of have that kind of lifestyle. When it came time to go to uni, though, had the feedback that being an archaeologist wasn't going to make me any money and wasn't going to be a career in it. So I went into science, having not particularly done well in science in high school. But as part of my science degree, I took an elective in human anatomy. It was a comparative anatomy subject, which then led me to an academic who was a forensic anthropologist, and there was a subject in anthropology at uni. So I changed my major on a whim and went down that pathway and then just followed whoever would take me in terms of honours degree, postgraduate, and then just tried to, like you said, that community, just put myself out there and make that interest known. So I ended up doing a lot of training in human anatomy. So my undergraduate was in human anatomy. My postgrad was in physical anthropology, which is more human evolution, ancient human remains, but then applying those principles to forensic questions was what I really wanted to do. So I worked my way into that very slowly, but I've always had a fascination with bones and dead things, so it sort of all made sense in the end.
You were involved in a really interesting crime. You were brought in professionally to what I think is a really interesting crime where you actually were working with pathologists. And we often think of people as lone laboratory technicians or lone investigators, but it's so much a team effort. And there's a case I really wanted to talk to you about that you've got a lot more background on that you can open up with.
So I was brought in 2018 to identify whether bones that were found in a bushland area down towards Wollongong were human or not. The background that I was given was that potential human remains were found in a bushland scenario, that they'd also located a potential clandestine grave, which just means hidden grave. And they wanted to, A, determine whether the bones were human or not, and therefore direct whether or not more excavation needed to happen or more searches needed to happen. And if they were human, would I be able to help with the excavation of the remaining parts of the clandestine grave, because there was significant evidence of animal scavenging. So it had been partially dug out over time, and then excavate that and then help the pathologist analyse any skeletal remains that were found.
So what are you doing when you get that call?
Jumping up and down with excitement. It was my very first case. So I was very nervous, but also very excited to be recognised enough in the community to be asked to go down and help with this particular case. So I went to the scene, and the skull was one of the first bones that was found. So it was very clear to the investigators that it was human, but they needed someone official to come in and give that determination. And then from there, it was a excavation approach to the grave itself, but also lots of line searches because there had been scattering of remains as part of that scavenging event over time. So doing lots of line searches of the area, lots of sifting through leaf litter and dirt, trying to find remnants of the bones that might give an indication of cause of death, but also the identity of the individual. They had an idea who that person was. They had some intelligence as to how that person had died, and they just wanted to get some confirmation on that.
But had they not known that, you're then looking at trying to age the remains as well, aren't you?
Yeah.
Not just in terms of how old the person might have been, but how long they may have been there. Have they been there 100 years? Have they been there 4 years?
Yeah. So the major role of a forensic anthropologist on scene is first and foremost to determine whether bones are human or not, because obviously that's going to determine whether or not police are going to continue with an investigation or whether they can pack up and go home. Once those remains have been determined as human, then you can do a preliminary on-scene biological profile, which is determining whether remains are male or female, age at death, so how old they were, which goes towards helping confirm the identity if someone is known, or to help create a profile that might help with investigation further down the line if the person is not known or there's no suspicion as to who that person could be. You can also look at aspects of the skeleton that might give an indication of ancestry. And then we always get asked the question, how long has the body been here, or how long has the skeleton been here, which is probably the most difficult question to answer out of all of those.
So what are you actually doing at the site? You're finding bones. What sort of testing are you doing on location immediately for the police, if any?
It's all visual observation, so using your experience and your knowledge of the human body to look for clues that are expressed through the skeleton to help you answer some of those questions about the biological profile. So the skeleton is quite what we call plastic, so it means that the more forces that are applied to it over time, the more the bones can actually sort of remodel and modify themselves. So people with big muscles will have lots of big, strong muscle markings.
This is prior to death, clearly.
Prior to death. And, you know, in terms of ancestry, we're looking at long-term ancestors. So where your ancestors spent a lot of their time, the climate can actually influence your skull features as well. So nose shape, eye shape, cranial shape. And you're sort of looking at those clues to help to get an idea of where that individual's ancestry may have originated.
I didn't realise climate could affect face shape.
Yes, so
Why?
things like extreme heat, extreme cold, it's all about heat loss, heat retention, keeping dust out of the eyes if you're living close to the equator and in sandy areas, or if you're up in the ice caps, trying to maintain the health of your eyes and being able to warm the air over long periods of time. So it can impact your stature, so your height, as well as your face and cranial features. So in this particular instance, I showed up and I was presented with the skull and asked, is it human? So yes, they are human. The investigators wanted a pretty quick determination on sex and ancestry of the individual because they had family that were coming down to bless the area where the remains were found because of cultural reasons. And so they wanted to at least have a preliminary confirmation that the profile that I was seeing fit the profile of the person that they suspected those remains to be, to help give the family some preliminary closure.
Based on their intelligence.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is a lot of pressure, particularly for a first case. I had to be very careful with my terminology. Forensic anthropology is not a primary identification method, so we have to be very general with our terminology and our assessment. So we can't say definitively it's this, or we confirm it's this person. So I was able to very quickly determine that they were adult. I was also able to say that there were very strong male features on the skull. So the muscle markings, particularly neck muscle attachments and chewing muscle attachments on the skull, all of those features sort of remodeled the skull enough to indicate that it was very likely a male skull. And then looking at some of those features across the face in particular, I was able to say they definitely were not a Caucasian. but they did have some very strong Asian features. And so the person that they were suspecting these remains to be was of Asian ancestry. So that was enough for investigators to feel comfortable with allowing the family to come by and do their ceremony, and then continue to investigate and try and find more of the remains to try and potentially find the cause of death, but also just to be able to return as much of that individual back to the family as possible. So that's our primary goal, is to try and find a complete person to return back to the families.
We've been at the site. Now, if we go back a little bit, do you know what was leading up to that moment with the police and the investigation?
So the remains, they believe, belong to a Sydney businessman, 50-year-old male, who had gone missing in 2014. So I was called out in 2018, so there was a 4-year period between report of a missing person and the discovery of the remains. So 50-year-old male Paul Nguyen, he was a Sydney businessman who had owned a number of bakery businesses. I believe he'd recently sold them. And he also had some associations with some people in the drug business. He was last seen leaving a hotel in the Sydney area and driving away on CCTV, and then after that was presumably never seen again. Within a couple of days, there was something that seemed completely unrelated, in that a number of men were found smoking cannabis in a completely different hotel. And when the hotel manager went to kick them out, he found some rubbish bags inside the hotel and went through them and found some identifying documents that were associated with Nguyen. And so the police were called to investigate. And then a couple of months after that, they got a phone call from someone reporting to be Nguyen's friend, who had gone to an apartment in Western Sydney and had allegedly seen Nguyen deceased in a bathtub and had been able to leave without any incident, but was able then to direct the police to that apartment, and then they could do a further investigation there. So when police showed up, they found a big blood stain on the carpet, and then it was presumed that he had been murdered, and it became a homicide investigation.
So the family were quite prepared. It wasn't just a normal missing person case. Not that there's any such thing as a normal missing persons case, but it wasn't just the question of had he absconded or...
They literally had no idea what had happened to him. They did say that he had been behaving unusually in the hours leading up to him leaving the hotel, and he had indicated that he had to go and deal with a complicated situation. And that's the last bit of information that they had from him. So there was a period of time between him going missing and then the bloodstain being found in the apartment. Then I assume that the family would have been notified that they were now looking at a potential homicide.
In terms of persons of interest, if they've got an investigation going, were there any people of interest?
I believe that one of the men that were found smoking in the hotel became one of the persons of interest, and through the investigation they were able to identify at least one more of those individuals. The conclusion of the case was that there were 3 persons of interest. One that was primarily involved in what ended up being a manslaughter charge, a self-defense charge, and the other 2 were accessories after the fact.
What happens then? You're at the scene. Presumably you do your visual identification. What are you taking to your scene that someone else won't have there?
I took a camera only because I didn't know whether I would have access to the images that the police were taking at the time. But also in doing so, I still had to talk to the investigators to make sure that I was allowed to take photos and allowed to keep those as part of my analysis of the remains, which I was. I also took bubble wrap in case the bones that we found were in a fragile state, because they had been out in the elements for a period of time. We didn't know how intact those bones were going to be. So just to help with transport of the remains between the scene and the mortuary for a more detailed analysis, we just need to make sure that the bones didn't degrade any further. For the most part, the bones were in pretty good condition, considering they'd been out in the elements for 4 years. They had evidence of sun bleaching, so they were quite white and cracked and weathered, but they also had green colours on them, meaning that they were a little bit mouldy and getting some of the growth from being in the wet ground of the bush area that they were in at the time. So I also took a lot of things, a lot of calipers and things like that, in case they wanted me to do something on scene. But in the end, all of the measurements and detailed analysis happened a week later in the mortuary. And what I was doing on the scene was observational. I did end up taking some excavation equipment as well, because I did have to do a further dig in the clandestine grave, because it was only about half dug out by the animals that had scavenged at the time. And best practice when you find a clandestine grave is to dig down to what we call the natural ground level and the grave cut, just to make sure that you've excavated the entirety of the grave, but also to see if there's any evidence of the type of tool that they used to dig the grave, just to confirm or refute any testimony from the person of interest or any witnesses that they saw. So I had that equipment as well.
You mentioned that you can tell what sort of tool was used to dig a grave, potentially. How on earth do you determine that?
So I'll start by saying I'm not a tool expert, but you can sometimes get an indication of whether it was like an excavator, for example, or leaving cut marks in the side of a grave to indicate they used a shovel, or the size of the shovel. It's just if someone witnessed someone digging a grave, for example, and said, I saw someone in the bush with this kind of tool and it looked really suspicious, then potentially there is scope to look at cut marks in the grave wall and in the grave floor to determine what sort of tool may have been used to dig that grave, and therefore corroborate or refute what the witness said. The other thing to look at is if more than one person was digging the grave, there may be unevenness in the depth of the grave depending on who was stronger or faster. So you might be able to use the dimensions of the grave and what that grave looks like once you've emptied everything out to make some estimations of how many people as well. So again, it depends on the intelligence they've got going in and whether that information is useful for the investigation.
Is a pathologist at the site? Are there any other scientists, entomologists, anyone else there at the site with you?
If you watch crime shows, the pathologist always seems to be at the site, and then all the investigators are at the site. It does seem to be a very multidisciplinary event. My understanding from preliminary interactions with pathologists in Sydney was that going to the site wasn't something that was typically done. But in this instance, the pathologist was there, and they also had an interning doctor there as well for experience. So there were a pathologist and a pathologist in training, and myself. No entomologist because the remains were dry, so there was no point in having the entomologist, and the police dogs were also out, the cadaver dogs.
Do you interact with those other specialists while you're there?
I did. I obviously have to work with the police in the first instance, so they're directing where they want me to look and what they want me to do. But also the pathologist had the background of the case as well. So he was looking for something very specific in terms of cause of death, because ultimately that's going to be his role is to determine cause of death as well as help the coroner confirm the identity of the person. So he was looking for something specific. I didn't have all of the details of the case going in there, which is a good thing because it meant I wasn't biased in terms of what I was trying to look for. And then the dogs I also interacted with, because the handler was trying to get the dog at the time to indicate on the grave, because when I walked over to the grave, I could still see some bones sticking out. So there was still some in there. And they were trying to get the human remains dog to indicate on the skeletal remains, so then they could go and help us find some more that were in the leaf litter around. The dog was not playing the game that day, was not interested, which just meant that the line searches and the sifting was more of a human activity rather than facilitated by the dog.
obviously the bones need to go back to the mortuary after they've been collected, bubble wrapped, and looked after, and your chain of evidence and everything is in order. And then the pathologist has to do their job. Are you doing that with them at the same time, or are you doing that separately?
In this instance, I was doing it with the pathologist. So I have seen other cases where the anthropologist will work independently and they'll do their assessment and their report, and the pathologist isn't necessarily involved. But in this particular case, the pathologist and the anthropologist did the assessment together at the mortuary.
What are you both looking for now?
I was just doing a more intensive investigation. So I was taking measurements, I was looking more closely at the bones and trying to create that profile in a more detailed manner so that I had more information to create that report that was required at the end. The pathologist was looking specifically for the signs of cause of death that were related to, I guess, the intelligence that they'd had before they went to the scene to collect the remains.
Who's more adept at establishing whether or not this is a bone that's been chewed on by a scavenger with a strong jaw, or it's been splintered by something, or it's traumatic from a blunt object or a sharp object, a knife or whatever? Who's more adept at determining that?
Technically, the anthropologist should be quite knowledgeable in that. But having said that, anthropologists are not a one-size-fits-all discipline. So each anthropologist will specialise in certain areas. So there are some that are very knowledgeable about trauma patterns. Trauma is a big area and a very specific area, and there's not a lot of opportunity to train on that particular identification process in Australia. So there's only a few anthropologists that I think would be comfortable in being able to go to court and testify on particular trauma patterns in bones. And in terms of scavenging, there are things that you can look at. So scavenging and whether trauma on bones is post-mortem or whether it's happened at or around the time of death, you should be able to at least look for some evidence to be able to determine that. Some pathologists will also feel very confident in doing that themselves. But for the most part, the pathologists that I've interacted with, they're comfortable in assessing those trauma patterns when there's still soft tissue around the bones, because they've got other evidence to help to analyse those sort of trauma patterns. But when they're already fragmentary bones and there's other things happening there, then they're quite happy to hand over to the anthropologist to make that assessment. But again, it's a collaboration. It just depends on the experience of the pathologist and how much interaction they want from the anthropologist in that skeletal assessment.
What did the pathologist actually find in that case?
Through the sifting of the many mountains of leaf litter and dirt, a rib was found that had a very straight, looked like a cut. So it looked like it hadn't splintered naturally, it hadn't been trampled. It had very regular straight edge, like a diagonal edge to it. And I think a second rib was found with a very similar pattern. And so given that the pathologist had intel that the deceased had been stabbed and that was a potential cause of death, and that the stab was specific to the chest region, the pathologist was very interested in the shape of the defect on these particular ribs, and I think was very interested in examining those ribs in particular back at the mortuary as the potential evidence of cause of death.
And then possibly determining what sort of weapon?
Potentially, but the ribs were quite fragmented anyway, and they were also very aged. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think any microscopy or histology was done on the bone, so it was really all visual observation. So I don't think they were able to say the weapon that was used, but the pathologist was quite confident in being able to say that it looked like a sharp object had created that pattern that was visible in the rib.
Where were you then? You've done your report. What happens with you? Do you just then disappear back into
the general population?
Into the general population again until you're called again? What happens with you regarding this case?
After we went back to the mortuary, I assisted the pathologist in their assessment. after everything that I had done in terms of measurements and the assessment and descriptions, the forensic odontologist came in with a X-ray of the deceased, who they believed it to be, put it together, and within 30 seconds confirmed the identity of the person through their dental records.
Did that annoy you?
It did a little bit. I'd spent 3 days on this case already, and I was trying to make this profile. I was really trying to be really thorough with it, and then coming in to save the day at the end was an amazing forensic odontologist. He's very good at his job, and he came breezing in and went, "Yep, it's this person," and then walked out again. So, which made it easier to write the report. And it was probably better that I didn't have that confirmation at the beginning, because I wasn't trying to fit my report to that profile. I was trying to be very objective, and it was good for the family in the case that he was definitively identified at the end. So I wrote my report, submitted it to forensic medicine, and then I thought that was the end of it. Eventually, a couple of months later, I received a subpoena to testify as to the patterns on the ribs for the case, because they had their persons of interest and they required someone to go and actually present that evidence to court. In the end, the person of interest agreed to the statements in the reports from the police, the pathologist and the anthropologist, no contest, and we didn't end up having to go to court in the end.
Do you know what happened to the victim and the people who eventually were found guilty?
Only what has been made publicly available. So the person of interest, or the accused, the accused said that they were called to an apartment that the deceased was working in. The deceased was believed to be involved in a meth lab, and the accused was called to the apartment where the deceased was located. There seems to be a bit of an issue with an extra person coming along that wasn't permitted into the apartment, and so a fight occurred. The person of interest said that the deceased came at him with a machete and he had to defend himself, and he managed to grab the machete off the deceased and then stab him in self-defense. And then he called a number of associates to help him come and clean up and dispose of the body.
So if that was believed by the police, which you presume if it didn't go ahead to trial, does that add to your body of knowledge that those marks on the bone were quite possibly caused by a machete?
The marks on the bone were very straight and they were very clean. So it would be possible that a machete was able to make that kind of marking on the bone. The testimony from that accused was that the machete did go into his chest region, so obviously being the ribs. I don't have information what side of the chest the cut went into, or the machete went into, but the statement is consistent. If that rib was in the area of the cut mark, that those marks, as I said, quite straight and orderly, which could have been done by a machete.
So you've had this academic background, and we all think we learn so much at university, and particularly with dedicated topics, but it doesn't often translate to knowing much in the real world when you get on the job. Did you feel like that, or did you feel far more confident with your academic into the real world?
I think something that was lacking from my training and my experience was how to interact with the other people on the scene. So if you just put me in a room with a bunch of bones and asked me to analyse that, I'm quite calm with that, and I'd be able to do it in my own time, and I'd feel quite confident doing that. But I was being asked to do that outside, surrounded by crime scene officers, detectives, a pathologist, the media showed up. And so there was a lot of pressure. When I was able to focus on the bones themselves, I felt calm and confident. I was still reluctant to give any sort of definitive determination. As I said earlier, I was very careful with my terminology and in what I was trying to say until we were able to get into the mortuary and do a more detailed analysis. So that pressure that I was probably putting on myself just made me a little bit reluctant to provide any sort of confident answer. The excavation side of things, I hadn't done excavation outside of what I teach in terms of excavation at uni. So So we use excavation as part of our forensic anthropology subject. I had done lots of those, but I hadn't done one in practice. So again, overdoing it, making sure I was very careful. So in terms of bringing in the academic into practice, there were some areas that I felt very confident in and areas that I was very nervous about and went, I don't know if I'm doing this right. But I was able to reach out to another anthropologist who does a lot of casework before I went on the case and got some advice from them. And they were very helpful in terms of telling me what to take and what to do. When it came to writing the report at the end, again, I was able to use their expertise and get them to help me to make sure that I had included all the right information and used all the correct terminology to make sure that it was useful in the investigation. I wasn't overstating things or understating things. So I think going from academia to practice, relying on that community and getting some feedback at all stages of the process and not trying to do it all by myself, I think that was a big lesson that I learnt throughout that process.
This has been incredible. Thank you, Hayley. You're so articulate and eloquent, and I loved the way you told this story. And we were with you every step of this, feeling for you and with you. And thank you so much for your passion and your work and your contribution.
Thank you so much for having me.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox, and produced by Holly Mitchell and Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.